right. All right. Good evening, everyone. As you know, we have pizza, so please help yourself throughout the evening. We also have some extra T-shirts, stickers, coasters, both from Okta, from us. Thanks for coming out on this lovely Wednesday evening. Welcome to the October edition of the Garden State Java User Group meeting. We're happy to have you here. So before I introduce Matt, we'll go through a couple of our usual slides. And so this is the agenda. So we always thank our sponsors for their support throughout the year. Talk about what's new, then I'll introduce Matt, and then we have some information for you after Matt is done. Our platinum sponsor is JFrog, DevOps company. Give them a look and see what they can offer. They just had their own annual Swamp Up conference, I think last month. And so that's JFrog. Azul, we had Garrett Grunwald here last month from Azul, along with Ivar Grimstadt, and so they're our silver sponsor. So we, they have a downstream distribution of OpenJDK, which actually is the first downstream distribution that includes their coordinated restore at checkpoint, or otherwise known as crack. Not that crack, but you can use that particular downstream distribution. Our partner is DevNexus. There's been a call for papers that's going to end sometime soon. It did already. Okay. The conference will be in April 9th through 11th next year in Atlanta. So you will hear more about that as we go. And then our per meeting sponsor is JetBrains. As you know, they make IntelliJ IDEA among other IDEs. So they provide the license that we give away at the end of the meeting. And Jakarta EE and the Eclipse Foundation, they provide hosting via Crowdcast, which we've used in the past. So they offer this to all the Java user groups. All right, what's new? First and foremost, MicroProfile 6.1 was formally released a couple of days ago, and the three specifications that have been updated are MicroProfile config, MicroProfile metrics, and MicroProfile telemetry, which is one of the actual newer specifications of the framework itself. So, and then there are plans to work on MicroProfile 7 sometime next year. And one thing that dawned on me today, we just surpassed our 3-year anniversary as our rebranded Java user group. For those of you who may have been around, thank you. Yeah. For those of you who've been around for a while, we were the ACGNJ Java user group, so we've been going for a total of 22 and a half years thereabouts under the old name and the new one. And so I thought I'd put that in there. So it was October 1st of 2020. We relaunched the website. We went on our own as a nonprofit, and everything has been awesome ever since. All right, so enough of me talking. Thank goodness. So we're happy to have Matt Raible back. This is not his first time here. He was here in 2019, and then he presented with Josh Long remotely, I think about a year or two ago. So he's a Java champion, web developer, Spring developer advocate at Okta. He loves to architect and build APIs and slick-looking UIs using CSS and JavaScript. When he's not advocating Okta and open source, he likes to ski with his family, drive his VWs, which I'm sure you'll see a picture of at some point. It's just amazing what a cool looking VW bus that he has. And then he, to my own heart too, he likes craft beer. So that's a good thing. And he's also, I think you're a contributor or participant in the JHipster framework. So that is I guess it's a UI, development tool platform. Okay, yes, I know. I do the updates, every week. I always check, but I, have not used it yet. I know you were here to talk about JHipster. once before, at least. Yeah. Yeah. So, but anyway, without further ado, Matt, please.
So Barry, you would like me to stay in front of the camera? Don't move around. No, I'll make it easy. All right. Is there a clip for this? Or I just got to hold it the whole time? Huh? I don't mind. Just tape it. Anyone got a paper clip? There's a paper clip. Yeah. See? Let's see if it works. Yeah. Put it in the collar. Look at that.
I was still gonna call it quits. Anybody? Nobody? Okay, very good.
No one's wanted by the FBI or anything, right?
I don't think they figured it out.
All right.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Well, so now I have to do one because usually I travel to exotic cities like Madison, New Jersey, and my boss just thinks I'm goofing off, right? And so I got to prove to him that I'm actually working. The ironic thing is my boss is here tonight, so, you know, make me look bad if you can, and we'll see how he handles it. So pretend like you're happy to be here. I want like hands in the air and stuff like that. Ready? 1, 2, 3. All right. Sweet. So one of the things I do want to mention is I have a number of books up here. There's DevOps tools for Java developers. There's also one I wrote called the Angular mini book. That's not only Angular, but there's a ton of Spring Boot in here, and all the Spring Boot code is in Kotlin. So that's kind of cool. And I have these little dongles that have different USBs and stuff like that. And so if you ask a question, I will give you one of them. All right. And if no one asks any questions and I have some extras, then oh well at the end. But let me bring up my presentation here. Actually, I don't need to, right? It's already here. I just got to start the right tool. Oh, there's the interior of the bus. Look at that. Put all custom gauges in and stuff like that. It's pretty cool.
So next time you got to drive it here.
Well, it's funny, you know, when I originally restored it, I planned on going out to like California and driving it up like Highway 1. And Highway 1's been closed for years, right? Because of like mudslides and stuff. But also it's a lowrider. Like you drive it like this and you're like, it might not be good for road trips, right? So, oh wait. So one of the things that's unique about this setup is since I'm sharing my screen, I don't have speaker notes. But this is just to tell you all that if you ever get into a similar situation, there's a Keynote app on your phone, or Google Drive will do the same thing. And you can actually pull up the your speaker notes that way. So that's what I'm going to do here. Come on, baby. So first of all, how many of you are Java developers or have written Java in the past? Is there anyone that's never written a line of Java code? Okay. All right. Just wanted to know that. Okay. Oh, I got to get on the Wi-Fi. And Drew is the Wi-Fi. It's open to everyone, right? Yep. No password needed in case anyone needs Wi-Fi.
Bring your hacking tools.
Well, it's funny because hacking these days is really just social engineering, right? Like people are barely even using computers. It's looking. And if there's no speaker notes, then oh well, it'll probably be a faster talk that way. Okay, let's go back and make sure this one's on the same network. Yep, Drew. Okay, one more try and then I'll just give up. All right, it's not working. So welcome to OAuth for Java developers. My name is Matt Raible. I'm a hick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana with no electricity, no running water. And I had to walk 1.5 miles to the bus stop every day. The cabin on the left there was built by my great grandparents in 1917. The one on the right is my dad's sauna business that never really took off. He sold one to himself. And let me get this cursor out of the way there. And my great grandparents were Finnish. So what they did is they actually built the cabin in 1917, but they built the sauna in 1916. So that's what the Finns do, right? They have the sauna first or whatnot. And this is our border collie, our old border collie there. First time he sat still in his entire life. So kind of a fun story. I live in Denver, Colorado with my beautiful wife and 2 children, Abby and Jack. You can tell this is an old picture because Jack is now 6 inches taller than me. They're both students at CU. So good timing on Jack being a freshman at CU with Coach Prime and all that. It's pretty fun. This is my middle child. His name is Hefe. I bought him off eBay in 2004 and he did not look like this. So it took 12 years to make him look like this. Those Porsche wheels are an indicator of the Porsche engine and the Porsche transmission. He's got 250 horsepower. He's super fun to drive. And you can see my wife there loving life. The kids, of course, staring at their phones. I work for a company called Okta. My dad has called it Okra for the first 3 years. And now he's graduated to Okta. He's still not quite at Okta, but he's getting there. And we acquired our biggest competitor, Auth0, a couple years ago. And when I first looked at the profile of their CEO, Eugenio Pace, I knew it was going to be a match made in heaven because he likes to, go outdoors. He likes to hike. He likes to be with his family, and he likes to restore his 1970 Karmann Ghia. That is a classic Volkswagen, similar to Hefe. So, I've sent him pictures of mine. He sent me back pictures of his. He's still at a frame level. He doesn't have anything. So, I look forward to seeing what he does there. So we've recently started calling, Auth0 by Okta. And if you want to get technical and talk to the marketing folks or even the sales folks, it's actually Okta Customer Identity Cloud powered by Auth0. But we're just going to call it Auth0 for the most part today. And so the agenda is we'll start with talking about what the heck is OAuth. And that's going to be a good portion of the talk. And so there's not really Java code, and it should be understandable to all of you. And if it's not, that's my fault. So please raise your hands, ask questions. I want to make sure when you leave the room, you kind of feel like you have a new superpower, and that is knowing how OAuth works. And then we'll do OAuth 2.0 in action. That means I'll actually do a live demo. Hope that works. And then I'll talk about how Java and frameworks and security frameworks in particular support OAuth. And then we'll talk about OAuth 2 authorization servers because that really isn't discussed a whole lot when people are talking about OAuth, because most of the talk is going to be about a client of OAuth, but there's also some OAuth 2 authorization servers that are available in the Java space. So we're going to start with what the heck is OAuth, because people often, there's so many different specs and how does it work and what is it? It's kind of nice to break it down into something that you can understand. So it started, or actually authentication on the web started way back in I think 80 or 97 or 98. And it was basically when you added basic authentication to a web app, right? And it was very easy to do in Apache. It's very easy to do in Tomcat. And a lot of times you were just modifying a file and putting a username and password in there, and they were both in plain text, right? And as long as the person knew that, they would get prompted, with a dialogue that would pop up and say, put in your credentials. And so it's very basic. And what happens is there is an authorization header sent with a basic prefix. And then this is just a base 64 encoded string. That's the username : password. So that's not very secure because base 64 is something you can decode very easily online or on the command line. And then you can see in plain sight what those credentials are. And so this, worked in the beginning, but then guess what happened? Clients, customers, right? They were like, hey, how can we log out? This doesn't allow any log out. The way you log out is you close your browser, right? And then they were like, how do we customize the dialogue, right? And there's no customization of dialogue. So we ended up with form-based authentication. And then form-based authentication usually meant that you had to have a database, right? And storing your users and passwords in there. And then people 5 years later figured out that maybe you shouldn't store your passwords in plain text. Maybe you should do some encryption and salting and all that kind of stuff. So it quickly became pretty complicated. And so federated identity kind of came along, and that, involves an identity provider that you trust and the service provider, which is an application, and it gives you the ability to, do more things instead of just storing your credentials in your app. That actually has the ability to, federate it between apps. So you can have multiple apps that use the same data store. And so one of the first ones that kind of embraced federated identity was SAML 2.0. And so this came out in 2005. And guess what didn't exist in 2005? A lot of things. Phones, right? We didn't even have smartphones back then. We had, Nokia phones, I think it was, right? right. Flip phones, right? And so, SAML was great because for a web browser, it did, what it needed to do. And there's two basic things. There's the authentication request protocol, and then there's an assertion of what's sent back from that authentication request. And so this is an example in the case of Okta. Is there anyone that actually uses Okta to log in to their company? Okay, so we have this dashboard that you get, and we have these chiclets on it. And one of those chiclets might be like Gmail, or it could be, Google Docs or something like that. You click on it, and it basically logs you in seamlessly, so you don't have to, have credentials for that. It just uses your Okta credentials. And so in this case, the service provider is the app. And then over here, when you click on it, it'll actually, log you in. So, part of Okta, click continue, comes over here, takes your credentials. And then, once you're logged in, this is a very old screen. There's no chiclets in there. It's just a list of apps that you could click on. And so a SAML assertion comes back. And one of the problems with SAML is there's just so much in there, right? And you can see the highlighted things are the things that are important. So there's so much kind of cruft around it that it's a little bit difficult to kind of, as a developer, figure out what you really need, right? There's the issuer, there's the name, the audience, and the attribute, right? The display name there. And so, it's really good for web SSO. But, remember, we're way back in 2005 when that was really all we needed it for. And guess what else was popular in 2005? SOAP for, XML-based web services. I don't even know what SOAP stands for. Does anyone remember? Simple Object Access Protocol. And it was messy, right? And you had to generate a lot of stuff, based on your Java code or whatever to make all the XML descriptors work and all that. And so lots changed since 2005. And that's where OAuth comes in. So, it's an open standard for authorization. Anyone can implement and provides secure delegated access to client applications, works over HTTPS that is required, and authorizes devices, API servers, and applications. And it uses access tokens instead of actual credentials, right? Basic authentication is credentials, form-based authentication is credentials. So in this situation, you will get a service provider or an identity provider to give you an access token, and then an application can access your data on your behalf. And so there's a lot of confusion when it comes to OAuth, and a lot of that confusion comes from people posting wrong things on the internet, which hardly ever happens, right? But happens a lot with OAuth. And if you go to Stack Overflow, right, you'll see it where someone asks a question and then there's an answer, and then there's an answer to that answer that says, no, go read my blog post. And then if you go to that blog post, there's comments on there that says it's wrong, right? And so one of the big takeaways I want you to have is if you ever see an OAuth tutorial where they're sending a username and password to the identity provider, stop reading, shut it down. OAuth does allow you to do it. It's called Resource Owner Password Grant. And it was basically added so you could do like Windows 3.1 authentication. You can't pop a browser, right? You need to actually send a username and password. That's the only way you can add, OAuth support to this legacy application. But for the most part, it's not recommended anymore. It's still in the OAuth 2.0 spec, but, try not to use it if you don't have to. So, the identity use cases back in 2006, that was back when OJ was driving his Bronco. Is there people that were born after 2006 here? Let's check in. Okay. So there was just simple login, right? You use basic authentication forms and session cookies and all that. A single sign-on across websites with SAML. Worked great, right? You didn't need much more than that. There was no mobile apps. The iPhone didn't even come out until the next June, right? 2007. Delegated authorization really didn't need to happen either. And so the delegated authorization problem basically came out, and it's how can you let a website access your data without giving it your password? And so at the time, the examples we like to use are Yelp and LinkedIn. So both of them did this in like 2005, 2006. And that is, once you signed up for a Yelp account, at the end of it, they would say, hey, are your friends on Yelp? How about we invite them? And so they would prompt you for your email address and your password from Gmail. And notice what they say here. You can select which ones to invite. And don't worry, we won't keep your email password on or your friends' addresses. We loathe spam too. But there's no guarantee there, right? That they won't keep your password because you're entering it in plain text. They're not going to do any encryption or anything on the client. They're just going to send it to their servers, right? So they could, in theory, keep your password and then maybe try it again in a few months, right? And this is something that, you know, even my parents today would be happy, right, to enter their credentials in because they memorize them, right? Like their impression of 1Password and my impression of 1Password are very different, right? Like I use a tool called 1Password. They just have 1Password, right? And I could log into most of their accounts and probably, you know, do it. Oh, that's a great trivia question. So let's see. We'll ask the audience here. There's 3 options I'm going to give you for the most popular password in the world. The first one is QWERTY, Q, right? ERTY. The second one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And what's the third one? Password. Okay, so who thinks QWERTY is the most popular? We got 1 vote. Who thinks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? We got half the room. And who thinks password? So they're all the top 3. But last I looked, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 was the most popular one. And then like password second and QWERTY's third. So yeah, people are lazy, right? And so, you know, this is the whole problem that OAuth is trying to get around. And if you've ever seen one of these, right, you've used Facebook to log into something, that is using OAuth, right? And so chances are, one of the cool things that Facebook did early on was they had this, and OAuth gives you the ability to delegate access to someone, but there's no identity associated with it. And so one of the things that Facebook innovated on was they invented a /me endpoint that you could talk to with your access token and get identity information. That later became OpenID Connect. You don't have to remember that now. I'll get into that later. So OAuth 2 came about, and you can think of OAuth like hotel key cards, but for apps. And so there's an OAuth authorization server. That's the front desk. You're going to have to give them your driver's license or some sort of identity, right, to get your hotel key card. So there's nothing in a spec that talks about authentication or how you would talk to that authorization server to get the access token, right? Like you can do whatever you want for your login. Just, you know, take some credentials, give back an access token. And credentials these days, you know, can be a username and password, but we're looking at cool things where you're getting passwordless, right? I don't know if you've heard of passkeys. Passkeys are like stored in your browser and distributed across your devices. The great thing is, you know, you don't even know what it is. It's just stored, right? And so, but it does identify you, so they're much more secure than passwords. And then the access token is your hotel key card. And then the resources are like the pool or your room or whatnot. And all those resources, when you access them, there is no identity information, right? They just know that you have access to them. And so see it in action and kind of give you a diagram of it. Delegated authorization with OAuth 2 with the Yelp and Gmail example is basically you saying, I trust Gmail and I kind of trust Yelp, and I want Yelp to have access to my contacts only, right? In the previous example, like you're giving it your Gmail username and password, which means they could probably access all of your Google APIs that you use, right? But in this case, you're just giving access to contacts. So Yelp is rewritten now. Instead of capturing your credentials, this just has a, you know, connect with Google or log in with Google button. And what happens once you click on that is it will take you and to the identity provider and prompt you to log in. Well, in this case, you're probably already logged into Google. So you never even see, you know, a prompt to log in. You might see a consent screen that says, you know, do you allow Yelp to access your profile and contacts? And then it comes back to the Yelp app. And then that Yelp app can now contact Google because it got that access token. So as this presentation progresses, these will get more details and more nomenclature and more talk in them. So please ask questions, right? I got all this swag here I'd like to give away, not taking it home.
Can you explain the difference between authorization and authentication?
So an authorization just means that you have permission. Authentication is like your identity, right? And so when we get into OpenID Connect, there's an ID token as well as an access token. And so people will often say, like, can I use an ID token to access a resource? And it's like, no, it has to be an access token because that resource has information that says if they came from here and use this access token, they can log in. They don't care about your ID, right? Your identity. And I think it is tough for developers to kind of, separate the two because we always kind of group them together, right? But without OpenID Connect, I think we would understand it better. But in the spec for OAuth, it says this is not an authentication protocol. It actually has nothing to do with authentication. But in the Facebook example, they kind of hacked in authentication because they had the ability to go to that /me endpoint and get, that identity information. So there's a number of different terminologies. When you talk about OAuth, there's actors, there's clients, there's authorization servers, resource servers, access token, and redirect URIs. And client is the most overloaded word like in programming, right? Like, is a client someone that pays me to develop for them? Is it a client, my browser? Is it, all those different things. So in this case, it's going to be the app that actually has or wants data from somewhere else. And so the actors are, resource owner. That is you, like you own the data in your Facebook profile. You own your Gmail contacts, right? You own your bank information, right? You are the resource owner. And client is the actual app. Resource server is where the data is. The authorization server is like the IDP. So if we switch these out and make them a bit less generic, you can see like the authorization server is Google. And then the resource server is like Gmail, or it could be your contacts or whatnot. And then when you get into clients, there's two different kinds of clients. There's public clients, which is basically a browser or a mobile phone, or there's confidential clients, which is something that you can protect. Like it's a server, right? It's behind a firewall. No one can get to it. It's a TV, which might be hackable, right? But I don't think so for the most part. But these, like if you have an actual client secret, you should never be storing them in a spa app. You should never be storing them on a mobile phone. And there's actually a great story from, I think, 5 years ago where someone reverse engineered the Twitter app and there was a client secret in there. And then they could act like Twitter talking to Twitter's API. So you could basically do anything, right? It's like super user powers kind of thing. So never store your secrets in, a mobile app or in a spa. And then there's client registration, and that is basically the DMV of OAuth. And so what you will do when you register an app, whether it's on Okta or Auth0 or you're using Keycloak or you're using Google, right? Or using Facebook, you will need to register that app. And when you register that app, you can create, different application types, a web application, Android, Chrome, iOS. There's PlayStation 4 on here. I wonder if they have PlayStation 5 now. I don't know. This is a little old screenshot, right? And then you name it, and then you give it some JavaScript origins and redirect URIs. So you're basically telling it that it can go to these specific places once that app has been registered, right? And the biggest problem that I had when I started Okta and a lot of people struggled with was the redirect URIs. Because if you don't have those correct, what happens is you get this screen that says your redirect URI is wrong. And you as a developer is like, what? Like, come on, I just put it in there, it's right. And so Okta is for workforce, right? But they have like this identity component that you can use to add authentication to your apps. But Auth0 does a much better job because they have actual developer-friendly error messages. If you look down in the bottom, you can click on this little box. It'll tell you the redirect URI you can set, and then you can be like, oh, I had the port wrong, or I missed a character in the URL or whatever. And so it's a nice way to look at it. And so once you've registered your app, then the authorization server has a number of endpoints that you can use when you communicate and gather, that access token. So the first one is the authorized endpoint, and this /OAuth2 is going to be different based on your identity provider, right? That's not all, but the authorized endpoint is what you will pass like a client ID and that redirect ID to. There's like a state parameter as well, and then it will return a code. And then the code will be sent to the token endpoint, and the token endpoint actually will return access token. And if you need a refresh token, that's another. So if you send a certain scope when you talk to the authorized endpoint, then you can get a refresh token in addition to an access token, because access tokens should be short-lived. They should be like a minute or 5 minutes. But a lot of times they're like an hour. I think our default is an hour, or it's like, days. I think Facebook had like a year for their access tokens, and that's why at one point you could like take over other people's accounts if you like inspected and grabbed the access token out of the HTML. So refresh tokens, if you're using a good SDK or a good OAuth library, they'll just handle it for you. So I was using Spring Security recently, and basically I get back an access token, I set the expiration on that for 30 seconds, and it would go and get me a new one using the refresh token without me doing anything, right? So that's a pretty cool feature, and that most OAuth libraries should work. So once you have a refresh token or an access token just in the beginning, then you can also call on some servers an introspect endpoint. So the interesting thing about an access token is it doesn't have to be a JWT. A lot of people think it needs to be a JWT, but in the spec, it can just be a random string of characters. And a JWT, right, is like a JSON document that's like base 64 encoded. But if you don't base 64 decode it, guess what it is? A random string of characters, right? So it fits the OAuth nomenclature of you can have just an opaque token, right? Auth 0 by default, if you don't pass an audience, will actually give you back a random string of characters that's like 60 characters long. You can't do anything with it, right? You can't decode it. It's just a random string of characters. So some people implement this OAuth extension where you can take that random string of characters and actually validate it against the authorization server, right? But if you do JWTs, then you can validate them locally and kind of save that call. And then there's a revocation endpoint. So that only works for refresh tokens. You can't revoke an access token. So that's why you should have them very short-lived, right? Only have them for 30 seconds or a minute, 5 minutes. And then those refresh tokens maybe be an hour, and you can, pull them that way. So if you ever go into like your Facebook login or your Twitter login and you've logged into apps and you want to delete access, you're just deleting the refresh token. So there's a number of different tokens, right? There's access tokens, which are short-lived or should be short-lived, opaque to the client, no client authentication. They're optimized for scale, and the revocation is dependent on the implementation. There's refresh tokens. There's also OAuth doesn't define the format of the token. I already mentioned that. And there's the self-encoded ones, which is the JWT, JSON Web Tokens, and there's also reference tokens, they call them, or I call them opaque tokens, and they're infeasible to guess kind of thing. So if we look with these terms in that same flow, we have Yelp, we have Connect with Google, the resource owner, right? We talked about that. They click on the button, and then you go to the authorization server, and you will send a response type as one of the parameters. You will also send the redirect URI. So the redirect URI is your responsibility. Like you've registered it at the DMV and you put it in there. And if you can't copy and paste that same string into your app and make it work, you got a problem, right? Things aren't going to work. But we're all developers. We make copy and paste mistakes, but you should be able to recognize when it says a 400 error, your redirect URI is wrong, like check it, right? Because it's actually in your URL. You can copy and paste it out of your address bar into Notepad or whatever, look at it, and then see what you registered it with. And if there's a mismatch, it won't work. And then, you do the consent again. This is an authorization server up here now. And then back to the redirect URI with the authorization code. And then there's an exchange of the code for an access token. And then once you have that access token, you can talk to the resource server. So there's more terminology, again, leading to more confusion. There's scopes, consent, and grants. So scopes are additive bundles of permissions when requesting a token. And so I know this is difficult to read here, but it says the application will be able to access your direct messages, or will not be able to access your direct messages or see your Twitter password. Well, that's good, right? Thank goodness, right? So it's important to read the scopes when you're actually presented with this consent dialog, because it also says the application will be able to see who you follow new people, update your profile, and post tweets for you. So that's a little worrisome, right? But in this case, this is old school or whatever, but we're integrating like Twitter and Facebook, right? So if we ever post anything to Facebook and post to Twitter, I don't know if it's still allowed anymore, but back in the day, people used to do that. And it basically decouples the authorization policy from enforcement and, you know, who owns the data, the end user, the target service, and who gets to specify the authorization policy, the end user, application owner. So you as a developer are specifying these scopes that get popped up in this consent screen. So if we look at scopes in this whole diagram, you'll see the scope is actually sent, right? We had response in there before, but now it's scope. So we want the profile and we want contacts. And so we're telling it there. And here it says, you know, public profile and contacts. And everything else is the same after that. And then the flow channels. So this was something that that really kind of blew my mind when I first learned about it. And I'd been, you know, working at Okta for almost a year before I kind of understood OAuth and how this flow works. So there's things that happen on the front channel, and then there's things that happen on the back channel. So when you hit that authorize endpoint and, you know, you get prompted for a dialog screen and, you know, you get the code back, that all happens on the front channel. That all happens in your browser. But then when it goes and gets the access token, that happens on a back channel. It has to be HTTPS. If you're using like Spring Security or something like that, it's happening without anyone being able to access it, right? Because it's not happening in the browser. Now, if you're doing a SPA app, you know, with React or Angular or something like that, it will do an XHR request, right? And so it's kind of back channel, but it's still from your browser. So it's not as secure as, you know, a server-side application. So this is what it looks like on the wire, you know, an authorization request. We're going to the endpoint there called OAuth 2/auth. So it doesn't have to end in authorize, right? There's no like spec about what your URLs need to be. They don't care as long as, you know, that one's for authorization. You're sending in Gmail, you know, insert and send. You're specifying the redirect URI to come back to your app. The response type is code for authorization code flow. Usually need a client ID. And a client ID is just like a license plate, right? When you register it at the DMV, you get back this client ID. And I don't know about you, but I don't care if my license plate is shown, right? It's Hefe on the bus, Hefe, right? And so that's easy to remember. I don't care. It's a client secret that you really need to be concerned about. So if people see a client ID, that can be worrisome. Client secret, definitely bad. And then it'll do a 302 and come back to your application with that code in that state. And then what happens is the code will be sent with the client ID and the client secret on that back channel. So if you're doing it on the SPA app, obviously it doesn't do the client secret, but you know, something like Spring Security will specifies that redirect URI and the grant type is authorization code. And then the response is going to be an access token. Token type will be bearer, tells how long it expires in. And if you pass in a scope of offline_access, that's how you get the refresh token. And so it'll come back with one there. If you didn't pass in that scope, you won't get a refresh token. And so to make the protected resource request, you take that access token and just like authorization basic we had in the beginning, this is bearer instead of basic. And then you put that access token in there, you specify the URL, and you will be granted access for it. So to add some more terms to this, all this going to the authorization server happens on the front channel. That's on the front channel. And then front channel back to your app, and then back channel to get that access token. So there's a number of different flows. There's implicit flow, and this actually was in OAuth when it first came out. And since then, we don't need as much. So it's optimized for browser-only public clients. And the problem with it is it returns access token in your browser's URL. And so it's usually in a hash, but if it's in a URL, it can probably show up in a server log, right? So you don't want access tokens showing up in server logs. And so this is somewhat deprecated and not recommended. Authorization code is kind of the gold standard. That's the one you should use. That's the one I use in all my demos. Client credentials is if you need to talk like between applications. So let's say you're doing microservices and you just want this service to talk to this service and you want to use OAuth, you can do that. There is no identity involved then. If in your downstream service, you need to know about the user's identity, you might just want to pass, you know, the token down from the gateway or something like that that has, you know, the user's identity information in there. This is just trusting between two clients. And then there's resource owner password. That was the Windows 3.1. right? Don't use that one either. It was there for legacy. There's assertion, which allows for authorization service to trust authorization grants. So this allows you to integrate like OAuth and SAML. It's mainly used for enterprises. And then there's also device flow. So if you've ever used Netflix, right, and it says, you know, you need to log into Netflix, go to this URL on your phone, type in this code, right? That's device flow. Another place you'll see it is with like CLIs, right? If you type a command in a CLI, it might pop a browser, you know, and make you do something, and then it actually authorizes that CLI. So there's 6 different flows, and that's what makes OAuth complicated, right? They're necessary because of how do you get consent from the client who is making the consent, and it adds a lot of complexity. And yes, I did use this picture because it looked like there might be some flow with the sprinkler in the background there. So I do want to recommend a couple places if you want to try out all of the flows. I really recommend authorization code flow for the most part. Like the only reason you might need the other flows is if you're implementing something legacy. But my colleague Aaron Parecki built this site at oauth.com/playground. And you can see down at the bottom here, you register a client and a user. He says, don't worry, we'll make it quick. And it uses authorization code. Pixie is proof key for code exchange. So that allows you to do secure authorization code flow on SPAs and in mobile devices. And how that works is it actually generates a client secret on the fly. And it stores it on the device, it stores it on the server, and it just exists for 2 seconds as the flow is happening, and then it goes away. So it's a way of making those more secure. And then there's the device code there, OpenID Connect, and implicit's in there too. But I know Aaron hates implicit. Yeah.
A YouTube viewer asks, what is the client state in the request?
State parameter. It's a state parameter. It's just a random string of characters. It could be whatever you want it to be, but it's meant for validation to make sure the initial request matches like what you get back. And so you as a developer, I saw a demo at DevOps Belgium where a guy coded like with Java from scratch, an OAuth flow. And there's nothing in there that he had to do to validate that state parameter, but it is in there so you can do validation, right? So it's not required anywhere, but for your client, it's there if you want to use it. But it doesn't mean anything. It's not actually storing state or anything like that. So some facts about OAuth 2.0, it's not backwards compatible with OAuth 1.0. Interoperability issues exist as it's not a protocol, but rather an authorization framework. It's not an authentication protocol. It's actually in the spec, right? There's that line. So if you're doing authentication and you're using OAuth, chances are you're doing OpenID Connect, or someone's like said they're doing OAuth when they're not really. And so OAuth 2 alone says absolutely nothing about the user. And in some cases, you might not need to know their identity, right? But in a lot of cases, as a developer, you might need to know. So that's where OpenID Connect came along. So Facebook had this /me endpoint. I think there was another like Microsoft or something was doing something similar. Maybe it was Twitter. And they basically decided to make it a standard. So now that endpoint is called a user info endpoint. And it basically makes it so you can access the user's information with an access token. And so HTTP is like the main way everything happens, right? And then OAuth 2.0 is for authorization. OpenID Connect is for authentication. And so Facebook Connect was an early incarnation of it. And then SAML 2.0, just the good parts, give you the identity stuff. So adds a new signed ID token that has to be a JWT. So unlike an access token that can be a random string of characters or a JWT, this one has to be a JWT. And it provides a set of scopes. So at one point, you might have saw we had gmail.insert, gmail.read, right? Like you wouldn't use those with OpenID Connect. You would actually have, you know, profile or email or address or phone in there. And then there's built-in registration of the client. So you could actually register a client without going and hitting Google or, you know, logging into Auth0 and doing it there. And discovery and metadata for dynamic federation. So it allows you to bring your own identity. And there's also this .well-known/OpenID- configuration that any like issuer or identity provider will give you all those endpoints. So that's why it doesn't have to be standard that you end with authorize or you have a token endpoint that ends with token, because there's this document that explains what all the different endpoints is. And the document will tell you whether certain things are available. For instance, there's an end session endpoint you can use to actually log people out of your application. Well, Auth0 by default doesn't have that. We're adding it. It'll probably be there by the end of the year. But right now, if you create a brand new one, there's no way to log out in a standard way. Now, we do have a way to log out in another way, but it's not conforming with the OAuth standards. And it supports high assurance levels and key SAML use cases. That's why OpenID Connect is important. Google, Microsoft, and Okta are all part of creating it. And the only thing that changes when you actually make a request with OpenID Connect, in addition to OAuth, you always have to have OpenID in there, and then you don't need anything else, but you're probably going to want some information, right? You're going to want email or profile or something like that. So I recommend passing that scope as well. Everything else is the same until you get the response, and then you get this ID token back in the response. And so the interesting thing is you can discover the OpenID provider metadata, right? That's that well-known endpoint. So if you look here, number one, that's what it looks like. So if you have an identity provider and you tack this on at the end, you will see this JSON document with all the endpoints and capabilities. And then two, you perform the OAuth flow to attain an access token with the token endpoint. And then you'll get a JSON web key set, signature keys, right? And this is specified in this document. And then you can validate the ID token if you want, because it's a JWT. And then you can also get additional attributes at that user info endpoint. So a lot of times the ID token will be very shallow. Maybe it doesn't have roles or anything like that. If you call this endpoint, you know, there might be roles and more information about the user in there. So to increase, you know, this diagram with more nomenclature, we have the client there, which is Yelp. We have the resource owner, of course, scopes, OpenID profile. We exchange access token and an ID token. And then once we have that, we can actually get the person's identity, say hello to them. And if you're not familiar with the JWT, it's just 3 different parts. It's a header, which specifies the algorithm. It's claims, which specifies like the issuer, the subject, might have roles in here or some other information that you custom want to put in there. And then there's a signature at the end that you can use to validate it. So the worst part of JWT, there is an algorithm called none, right? And there's websites out there that you can see when's the last JWT exploit. And it's like the service sign and, you know, the manufacturing floor. It's like 4 days since someone used JWT algorithm none, right, as their implementation. And we have a site called jwt.io that you can copy and paste your JWTs into, but you know, it's also just a encoded string. So if you have a base64 decoder, you can decode it anywhere. And so people often ask, can you do OAuth without a browser? And my answer is browser is required unless you're doing that client credentials, right? And you're talking between 2 different machines. Yep. You can do either one as long as. So the question was, if you paste an ID token into JWT.io, can you see what's in it, right? And then will you see like the scopes and stuff like that? If it's returned in it, right? Like a lot of times the request doesn't actually mean that the scopes will get included in the response, right? But yeah, any JWT that will go in there. And I actually struggled with this recently because I was developing microservices with Spring Boot, and I was getting back what I thought was a JWT and kept pasting it in there, and it kept saying it was invalid, but it was an opaque token because Auth0 has this security measure in place where you only get a JWT if you pass in an audience parameter, right? And so if you pass in an audience parameter, you get a JWT, otherwise you get an opaque token. So it was great for me because I was basically saying like, I know JWT.io is not wrong, right? But it totally looked like an AX or a JWT. The difference was it actually had, instead of 1 dot there, it had 2 dots. So that was like the indicator that, hey, this wasn't a valid one. And once I got that figured out, it worked great. Did you want a piece of swag, a book, or a dongle? Which book? We got Angular mini book or DevOps tools? All right. So there's 3 options if a user is involved. There's a web app can handle redirect. So this is like a Spring Boot app or a Quarkus app or whatever, right? It can be a Node app or whatever. Something has to be mapped to that callback URL that you passed in so it can process that code, get a token, do all that work. If it's a CLI or like a TV or something, you can use a device grant, which usually means you still have to go to a browser and paste that in, right? I'll show you a demo with the Auth0 CLI where we pop a browser and we do it for you. But I saw one other one today. I think it was GitHub CLI that it gave me a URL and it gave me the code and made me do the work myself. Right? It didn't pop a browser for me. And then the native app, this is really cool. So on iOS and Android, you can register custom schemes, right? So it's one of the problem with Electron apps. A lot of times when they do OAuth, they have to register like localhost 8000 for like a minute while the dance happens, and then they have to shut down the web server, right? But on iOS devices, you could register like com.okta.example as a scheme, right? And so then in your app, you can say the redirect URI is com.okta.example:// right? And then in your app, you would just look for callback, because that scheme will actually launch the app and then go to that URL in the app, right? And we don't have anything like that on native, right? On like Windows or Mac OS or anything like that, but they exist on both Android and on iOS, so that's pretty cool. And then OAuth 2.1 is in the works, and this has been largely pushed by my colleague Aaron Parecki, because there's these things like resource owner password grant and implicit grant that shouldn't be in there because they aren't that secure, and the fact that people can use them is kind of troubling, right? And so Pixie is required for all clients using the authorization code flow, and Spring Security actually supports Pixie by default, or it doesn't support it by default, but if you use our Okta Spring Boot Starter, it will do Pixie, and it's just an added, right? Generates a client ID on the fly. It only lasts for a minute or so, and then it goes away. The redirect URIs must be compared using exact string matching. So this is kind of developer friction thing, right? Because if you have an app that you register and you want to have it on 15 subdomains, usually just register star.domain.com, right? And they're actually in 2.1 forcing it. And then there's some other things that are improving. But here's the thing, like, our identity provider is going to say we only support OAuth 2.1? No, they're going to let you pay for what you want. Now, they might make you more for implicit resource owner password grant because they don't recommend them, but I don't see any identity providers currently being like, you can only use OAuth 2.1. I think maybe if you're a startup, you will be like, okay, I'll just ignore those things and not implement them, but it's still in draft. It's not finalized. It's just kind of an idea trying to capture the best practices of OAuth. And so now the fun part, getting into Java's OAuth support. So Java, the language, has no OAuth support. In fact, the JDK doesn't even have any way to write a web app. And the building blocks are provided by the Servlet API and Jakarta EE, which are not part of Java, right? Those are extensions in a sense. And so Jakarta Security 3.0 did add OpenID Connect support, so that's great. And then if we look at Java frameworks, there's MicroProfile, which Michael mentioned, JWT authentication. They have two different properties that you need to specify if you do MicroProfile for JWT authentication. Now, they don't call it OAuth, right? But it is OAuth in a sense. It's just JWT only, right? If you did an opaque token, like, it wouldn't work. So the interesting thing here is the issuer, right? They could have looked up the JWKS URL from the issuer. So I'm kind of mad at the MicroProfile folks for making us specify two properties, but maybe they did it for optimization, right? So they didn't actually have to go and, fetch the public key. They could just, you would code it in there, but it is lookupable, and there are MicroProfile folks that have seen me do this talk, so they are aware that maybe they should change it. But talking to the Quarkus folks, they're like, if you use our OIDC extension instead of the MicroProfile JWT one, then you only need an issuer, right? So some of them have workarounds, I've learned. If you're doing Quarkus, all you need is a small ride JWT dependency. If you're doing Helidon, you just need the MicroProfile JWT auth, and that's because both of them implement MicroProfile. So all the imports are like Jakarta imports if you're doing a REST API with either of those frameworks. Now, if you're doing Micronaut, they don't implement MicroProfile, but they do have the ability to have one really longly named property with the JWKS URL. If you're doing Spring Boot, they allow you to do an issuer, and most IDPs, that's all you will need. But if you're doing Auth0, We do audience validation as well, so you'll need to specify the audience there too. And then you might be asking, what about, these well-known frameworks in Java land, JSF, and Wicked? Well, if you're doing anything with these two, they're dependent on the servlet API. So anything that can provide OAuth to servlets will work with these frameworks. And if you're doing Jakarta EE and you want to do OADC, you can see that we wrote a blog post about it. It's a little cumbersome to define. It's one big old annotation with the longest name I've ever seen. And then the client ID, client secret, redirect URL, and some parameters. And we were not able to get this to be a property. So if anyone knows how to do that, that'd be great. But we did have to hard code it in there. And then if you want to get roles, it allows you to do that as well. So I love it because we have standards now in Java that are embracing this thing that's been around for 10 or 15 years, right? So it's like finally we're waking up and being more conscious of security. So now what I'll do is give you a little OAuth demo in action with Spring Boot. And so I don't have to mirror my screen. I'm already mirrored, right? So let's see here. Go to this URL. And that font's a little small, so we'll bump it up a little better. And then I have a demo.adoc here. And so I also have the ability to open up an ASCII doctor, so it looks a little better. We'll put that there and put that on the left. So you'll need Java 17, Auth0 CLI installed, HTTP, and Auth0 account. So put this on the right. I have Java 21 installed, I think. Yep, with GraalVM. The Auth0 CLI and HTTP IE. All right, so we're good to go. So we're going to create a Spring Boot app using start.spring.io. So this is right here. And the dependencies we're going to have, you can't see this window, but I can, so I'm going to move that out. It's just web and Okta. So Spring MVC and then the Okta Spring Boot starter. The base directory is Spring Boot, and we're just going to expand that and CD into it. And then we'll open this up in IntelliJ. How many people like Eclipse? 2. How many people use NetBeans? 0. How many people use IntelliJ? Everybody else. But what about VS Code? We got a few. All right. It was funny at Devox, they had it was 90%, 93% IntelliJ. It was like 1% NetBeans, 1% Eclipse or 2% Eclipse and like 3% VI, right? So it was funny how much it dominates. I didn't ask, okay, how many VI for Java? Right, no, not for Java, right? Right. All right, so the Okta Spring Boot starter is just a wrapper that kind of encapsulates the OAuth 2 client, the OAuth 2 resource server from Spring Boot. So depending on what properties you set, it'll activate certain things versus if you use the Spring Security straight up, you have to add different dependencies for different things. So we just kind of simplify that for you. And so this is actually created, right? We can go in here and we can do Gradle W boot run to start it up. Just to look at what happens if we haven't configured anything. If we go into our browser, we got it open over here, localhost 8080. Oh, this is a PWA, right? There's actually nothing there. It was just stored in my browser. You're wondering maybe why didn't it redirect to Okta? Well, we haven't configured anything. And what Spring Security does by default is it will just use regular username password. And so you can put in user and you can put in that password. And then you might be saying, well, why does it show an error? Well, that's because you haven't mapped anything to the root URL, right? So this is a 404, it's not a 500 or a 503, right? Like things are working, but it looks like it's not working because there isn't anything there. So we'll go and fix that and make it look better as time goes on. So now we're going to use the Auth0 CLI and run Auth0 login to get our domain. So I'll clear this so you can see it at the top there. Login. So this is going to use device flow, right? And it's saying, how would you like to authenticate? I'm going to say as a user, press enter to open a browser, and then it'll, have this confirmation code and ask me to confirm it. And once I confirm it, then I have to actually continue with GitHub here and authorize. And then I have to continue with Okta. And you don't have to do this because you don't have to jump through all the hoops I do, because we're the most secure company in the world. So that's why we have to do all this. But you're being redirected back. Come on. And then we get the consent screen, right? With all the different things that it can do to my Auth0 tenant. And then once that's done, then it says what? We're good to go. So this is my tenant here, right? And so back to the tutorial. We'll add that domain to our application properties, configure a resource server. So I'm just going to copy these two properties here, and application.properties is in the source main resources directory. We'll put those in there, and then we have the tenant information here, right? The domain. Take that, go back to IntelliJ, put it right here. And it is kind of confusing that you have to put the slash on the end, but it is required. If you don't put the slash on the end, it doesn't work with Spring Security. So just so you know that. And then we're going to add a hello controller. And this is a cool feature of IntelliJ. If you didn't know, you can just paste a class like that into a package, and it'll do all the imports and put the package and all that for you. So that's pretty slick. And this is just going to return like the person's name, right, who logged in. And so since we're using OAuth, we're not using OpenID Connect, it's not going to have a whole lot of identity information. So this is HTTP IE. We can do HTTP 8080 hello. Now we'll get a 401, right? It's secured now with OAuth. And then we can create an access token with the CLI using that audience. And it doesn't matter which app you use. I have a bunch registered. It's going to pop a browser, make me log in. And then it gives me that access token. And I can clear again and set that as a local variable. Then I can hit that endpoint hello with authorization var and token. And now I actually get a 200. And you can see it says hello to my principal.name, which is just the sub claim of the access token. And we could also take the access token, go to jwt.io, see what's in it. Scroll down. And you can see it's got, you know, the algorithm and all that in there. And then these are some roles I added with Auth0 actions. So normally you wouldn't see this, but I've just configured my tenant to have those. And then the rest of it's, you know, pretty generic stuff, just the time it expires and, you know, the audience and the subject and all that. So it is a valid JWT. And then go back to our instructions here. And you can also add an OIDC application using Auth0 CLI. So you can create it with Auth0 apps create. And so before, all we needed was the issuer, right? And that's doing the validation, you know, of the JWT. But now we need a client ID and a client secret to actually do, you know, the login. So I've reached the limit of the entities of this type. So let's see if I already have one. Add Auth0 apps list. This kick-ass cars one should work. Let me do list reveal secrets. So this is the client ID. And so in our application.properties, we can add the client ID, Okta OAuth2 issuer, or not issuer, but client ID. And then the client secret. That's right here. And then all that should work. And then we'll add a home controller to display the person's full name. So we have more than just a subject now, right? Put this right here. And we'll map it to that slash endpoint, right? So it'll resolve instead of giving us a 404 now. Then we restart the server, which I think was running in IntelliJ here. But you could also run it, you know, in your IDE right there. And then if we go to localhost 8080, oh, that's still JHipster PWA there. It logged me in, right? Single sign-on, right? I was already logged in. If I did a new incognito window, then it would prompt me to log in.
I'm gonna read this question.
Okay.
The YouTube viewers, instead of creating a new username and password for the Okta system, is it possible to integrate the Okta system with the existing company's LDAP authentication server so that login to Okta can be seamless, just like Coboros authentication system?
Yes, we have many connectors for many existing systems if you want to do it that way. Like LDAP is, a little old, but yes, we can integrate with many legacy systems. And Active Directory is one of our most popular that we integrate with. And then the other thing that we have with Auth0 is you can actually use your own database, right? So you can actually connect your database to Auth0 and not even have Auth0 store it. The other thing you should know about is there's a cool standard called the System for Cross-Domain Identity Management called SCIM. And SCIM will allow you, we've actually implemented JHipster with an Apache project just as a proof of concept, but it allows you to sync your users between IDP. So how it works is you will actually put a library into your app, and that will make certain endpoints available. They're REST endpoints. And then Okta or Auth0 or whoever your identity provider is will communicate with those endpoints when anything happens to your user. So if you do something on Okta, it'll send those down to your app. If you do anything in your app, it'll send those back to Okta. So it's meant for that syncing of the users and their attributes and all that. Okay, so that was one, and then back to our instructions here. The other thing, I won't clone the repo because I already have it here in the example app, dev auth0, auth0 Java, OAuth examples. So this is up on GitHub, and I'll give you the URL, but just to look at it here, the remote. Is Octadev OAuth or Auth0. I always get those confused, right? Auth0 OAuth, like it's easy to mix those up. Java OAuth examples. So I've already got a Micronaut in here and it's already configured for my tenant. So I can just cd Micronaut. But I was supposed to do Quarkus first, so let me do that. And then Quarkus dev. This is using the latest version of Quarkus, and then I can do, the HTTP 8080 hello with that authorization endpoint, and it says invalid token. So that's because I didn't set the token here. So Auth0 test token, create a new one in this terminal. The last one is only set in the existing window, so we need to get a new one. And then once we have that, we can go ahead and set it. And then everything works, right? So Quarkus, easy as well. And Micronaut, NVM and N run. This is Micronaut 4 is actually the fastest when you compile it with GraalVM to start up. So those guys have done a great job in making things work. I don't know why that's happening. Maybe it doesn't like 21, but let's see if it works. It works anyway, right? So ignore the stack trace. So back to the presentation. Just to let you know, right, this give you a chance to look at it again here. This repo is at github.octadev auth0 examples. So you can clone this whole thing if you want, and the README has instructions for making them all work and doing the same thing I did. So there are a number of Java security frameworks as well. And what I've noticed is if you're not tightly coupled to like an existing framework, it's really tough to gain traction. So Apache Shiro is an Apache project that when I met my wife, I basically felt like I dreamed her up because I met her at a friend's birthday party. And I had been like thinking about my next girl for a while. Like I got a divorce in 2007. And so this is like 2010. And I'm starting to, get back into the game. And I'm like, I had actually watched some TV late at night. Has anyone ever seen The Secret? Right. And so it's a messed up enough show that I was like, that's weird. I'm not watching that. But then I went to bed and I looked it up on Wikipedia and stuff. And it's basically like the law of attraction. If you believe in something, it'll happen. And so I was in a state of mind that was like, well, why not dream up this girl? right? And so I was like, I want her to ski, I want her to mountain bike, I want her to have a dad, I want her to have a brother. Her brother has to like golf, like all this stuff. I had a list of like 10 things, and a lot of it was based on my previous marriage where there's things I didn't like, right? And so when I met her that night and I started asking her questions, I was like, oh my God. Like, I was like, are you in tech? She was like, yeah, have you ever heard of OWASP? I was like, oh yeah. And then I was like, what was the next one? Do you ski? And she was like, no, I telemark, which is like a more intense form of skiing, right? And then mountain bike, she was like, oh yeah, I was just in Moab last week. And so all these things, she was checking every box, right? And so she happened to be in security, right? She sold security products like firewalls and stuff like that. So the first time I went with her to a conference, it was a security conference in Kansas City. I met, you know, one of her friends in the industry, and the person asked me what I did. And I was like, I'm a developer. And the guy was like, I bet I can hack your shit. And I was like, dude, we just met. Like, why you got to be so rude or whatever, right? But that's the nature of security people, right? And so I wanted to put like a more friendly face on security for developers. So this is way back in 2011. I made an Apache Shiro video. It was up on their site until like earlier this year. And so that shows you how stagnant that project has been on like doing their promotional materials and stuff like that. So it is a good project, but it's, you know, it's used in a non-standard way. It does have OAuth support, but it's really hasn't caught that much traction. Pack4j is another one that has a ton of different extensions for SAML or OAuth or for OIDC and stuff like that. But I've talked to some of the Spring security people, and they've been like, the code quality is not that great. I don't trust it, right? And so you don't see that much in the wild either. And then there's Spring security. And so the cool thing about Spring security is if you're using a servlet-based framework, it has a way for you to hook it into that framework. So JSF, Wicket, right? Any of the ones that we have in Java land, you could hook Spring security into. And Spring security has been around since the CG security, which is like way back in 2005. So it's got quite the track record. There's also a number of OAuth 2 authorization servers. So this is if you don't want to use Okta or Auth0. Now we do have free, you know, developer accounts, so you can use us for free up to 7,000 monthly active users. But if you're on a plane, you can't connect to the internet, the Wi-Fi sucks even if you can, you might want to use one of these, right? So Keycloak is a popular one that we use in JHipster. We spin it up in a Docker container, just works, right? It's really nice because we can pre-configure it with the application registrations, the users, and all that kind of stuff. Spring Authorization Server actually was a product 3 years ago, and they killed it. And then the community was like, no, we want it back. And so they've recreated it. It's got a 1.0 version out, and they're iterating on that a bunch. It's got all kinds of new standards supported in there, including pass keys and stuff like that. And this is another open source one from WSO2. I haven't used it personally. I have used the first two. And then you might be asking, what about JavaFX, right? Like if you talk to people that do JavaFX, they're usually pretty passionate about it, right? You use JavaFX to do desktop applications, right? You don't use it to do web apps. Well, it's basically, there's one project out there that adds OAuth support for it. It's from Microsoft, and it only works with Java 8, and it has to be the Oracle JDK. So to me, this says that anyone that's doing JavaFX doesn't really care about authentication, right? Maybe they're doing desktop apps that don't require it, right? Like Microsoft Word doesn't require authentication. Well, maybe it does now because they prevent me from using it, right? If I don't have a license, but a lot of JavaFX apps, you know, maybe they don't need it, right? They're doing some sort of visualization or stuff like that. But the hard part is it's just like Electron, right? Electron's very similar. You use Electron in VS Code or Slack, right? Both of those are Electron based. It has to listen on a port for that callback. So JavaFX would have to do something similar where it spins up a simple web server, listens for it, and then it comes back. So there was something out, I think, in Java 18 called JWeb Server. It is a simple web server that is part of the JDK, but it's meant for demos, but maybe you could use it here. But what I've seen is there's just, in this JavaFX community, there's not much interest in OAuth or OpenID Connect. And then you might be asking, you know, what about other JVM languages? Do Scala and Kotlin support OAuth? They do, and their frameworks do. So Play has good support for it, and Ktor is for Kotlin, has good support for OAuth as well. And I wrote this whole post that's got all of this broken down into different sections. It's even got some videos in there that shows how to develop various resource servers with the popular frameworks. So you can read that. And you can play with OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect on developer.auth0.com, as well as that OAuth.com/playground I mentioned earlier. And if you want to do like I'm doing, speak about security and identity and have people mentor you, you can join our Auth0 Ambassador program. It's pretty easy to apply, and we help you and we educate you on these topics so you can, become a developer as well. And then this is where I get good credit. So we have this newsletter that goes out, and I am currently in a competition with the rest of my team to get the most subscriptions. And so if you use this URL or this QR code and subscribe to our newsletter, I get points. And I don't think they're tracking unsubscribes, right? So you can just sign up, you can unsubscribe next week. I get all the points, it'll work well. And then thank you. You can find me online at raibledesigns.com. My handle is mraible. Speakerdeck.com is where this presentation is published. It's already there. I published it at 6 o'clock. Most of my code is on GitHub. And may the auth be with you. So we do have some books to give away still. But also, if there's no questions, I'll just put them out and you can grab them.
I do have a question.
Okay.
And I think it's a big question. I tried to get an app to use OAuth. And the frustration that I faced is that when I get errors, I have no way of debugging them. I don't know it's intentionally not giving me enough information back so that I can find out what's going on, what's going wrong. And I understand why it's doing that. Is this a common theme, or is it just me who's feeling cheated that way?
So I think it's the IDPs. I think it's the identity providers, because I've seen this at Okta, right? If you put in a bad URL, it gives you a 400 with no other information, right? Not in your console, not in your browser, anything. If you use Auth0 and that same thing happens, if you're smart enough, there's this little box down in the corner that you can go down and click on and see what URL it's sending. But still, like, even that is not in your face, right? So it's this balance I think a lot of them are trying to do between security and, not giving an attacker too much information, right? And trying to protect you. But I agree. It's the number one problem that I've experienced with helping developers, right? They don't understand the error messages, right? But I understand them all because I've seen them so many times. So I'm trying to make it work.
You started working at Okta, I believe you said. Were you there when it first started, or did you join later on? That's my next question.
So I got lucky. He asked, when did I start working at Okta? So I've been an independent consultant for most of my career. And I started as a contractor for Stormpath in the spring of 2016. And that summer they came to me and were like, we want to hire you full time. And I was like, I don't do full time. And then, a month later, they were like, think about it. Come up with your dream job, right? And so the job they offered me was like a Java developer working on their SDKs. I actually don't want to do that. I want to, do the advocacy thing. And I'd like to do Java and I'd like to do JavaScript too, right? I like them both. And they were like, okay. And I was like, and you got to pay me well. And I want 8 weeks of vacation a year. And they were like, okay. And so that's how I came on board. And then 6 months later, Okta bought us, right? And they bought us the week before the IPO. So that was nice timing, right? And then I've been there, it'll be 7 years in February.
You get a lot of things by setting up your dream demands.
Yeah.
I still got the Google Doc, right, that I wrote, 1 pager. And so you said you had a follow-up question?
Yeah. So did you know that Okta used Okta to do their own authentication for signing into their own servers, or did they use a different company?
No, we have a whole team that's called, so the question was, to repeat it for the camera, does Okta use Okta to provision thing and deprovision people and all that kind of stuff? Yes, we have a whole team on Okta. And so we have regular here talk about it, even at our main Octane conference, they talk about it. And it's funny because we still use passwords. Telling everyone passwordless. And last week they were like, okay, we're actually going to do it. By the end of the year, we want to get rid of passwords internally, which I think is great, right? Because we experience the pain before our customers do. So a book or a dongle?
A dongle.
Okay. There you are.
And it's what kind of dongle?
It's just like USB-C and USB mini and stuff like that, and it's got our brand, so you can look at it and be like, I love that Matt Raible guy, right?
Apple adopted it.
Right, that's true. And then, did you want something since you asked a question? No? We had one in the back?
I have a question about the refresh tokens. So you were saying how they should be short-lived, right? Do you have to like keep track of that, or does that happen? Like, let's say you're trying to use the resistance token, and then it will tell you that it's expired.
So,
You then refresh it.
so the question is about refresh tokens and how you handle them, and they should be short-lived. It's actually the access token that should be short-lived. Refresh tokens can be months or years even. I wouldn't recommend years, right? Like, months, weeks or months is better. But there's two ways to handle it. One is reactive, right? Where you try catch, right? If there's an error, something's expired, then you actually go and get a new access token with that refresh token. The other one is you actually are proactive and you set like a timer, right? Based on the access tokens timeout, and then you try to get a new one before that happens. But you shouldn't have to do any of this as a developer, right? Your SDK should do it. Spring Security should do it. Quarkus's OIDC implementation should do it. If you're using Node, like the library you're using should do it. So if you're implementing one of those frameworks, you have that choice. If you, a security developer on the framework, but otherwise as like an end user of the framework, shouldn't have to worry about it. And if you do, like, file a bug, right? And be like, hey, I shouldn't have to worry about this. Did you want a book or a dongle? DevOps book. All right. I'm not going to walk all the way up there, but I'll hold it for you. Or you will? All right.
Where am I going? But the access token is going to stay for some more time.
So he's asking if you can refresh or revoke access tokens, because it's 5 minutes as a time to live, and something happened, permissions changed, or they got new roles or something. So you need one. No, you cannot refresh an access token. But we do have a new feature we're implementing in our IDP that's not really OAuth specific, but we have universal logout. So you can log someone out of all their apps, right? And we're using it as a security measure because we're starting to implement AI that can detect like anomalies and log everyone out. Like there's an intruder in the building, or there's someone, being malicious on this account. And so it's not really part of OAuth, but it is a feature that we have. The universal logout, yeah, totally, yep. And I'm sure you could use it for a single user, right? You don't have to use it for everyone, but it's basically meant to make everything more secure, right? If you see anything wrong, like just log the person out. They probably won't mind logging back in, right? And you already got some swag, right? So you're good. Well, we had the lady in the back there. That you're looking the other way. You raised your hand for a second. No? All right, never mind. Yep. So the question is about 2.1 and OAuth 3.0. I know nothing about 3.0. I only know about 2.1. So feel free to speak up, but I haven't heard much about it.
So one of the things that irks me the most, if I go to websites, you have to log in. Either the logout is buried,
Yep.
or doesn't exist.
Yep.
And so I have to, if it doesn't exist, does that mean that they're still on that original authentication?
So the question about if a logout doesn't exist, or the fact that logout is off. I have a fun story to tell about this. When I first started at Okta, it was actually a storm pass. So JHipster had an OAuth support in it, but JHipster actually had an OAuth server, an authorization server in it. And on the client side, it would store an actual client ID and secret. So when I went to like look into integrating Okta, I was like, holy shit, we got a real problem here. Like we're storing a secret in our JavaScript, right? And so we basically, ripped it all out and made it work with Keycloak, and then we made it work with Okta and Auth0, right? Or it should work with Azure AD or anyone. But one of the things that we did not implement was logout, right? Because my theory as a developer was like, how often do you log out of Facebook? Never, right? How often do you log out of Twitter? Never, right? So why do we need logout if we have single sign-on, right? But as a developer, if you're developing an app, you want to log out and try different roles or whatever, right? So we just tell people, well, restart the server or start a new browser. So after like 6 or 8 months of people complaining about the no logout feature, we did implement it, and it was using the end session endpoint, which actually is part of OAuth. So it should be possible, but I think there's a lot of developers that think like I do or did at the time, which is like, why do you need to log out? We got single sign-on. You never need to log out, right? And so it should be possible, right? It is possible, but sometimes you'll get proprietary APIs for logout, but I think that's why people do it. They're like, you don't need to log out, right? You're not a developer.
I'm one of the weirdos that does log out of it.
That's not the only way.
Among other things.
Did you want a piece of swag?
Yeah, maybe at the end I'll take a look.
Okay.
Am I the only one who logs out of, before they replace their phone, logs out of all their apps? Reset the phone, still logs out to the session.
That I don't.
Oh, I reset it to factory settings.
No, but before I do that, I log out of the apps
Oh.
in case there's a session stored on the server, and you kill that too.
Oh, I don't do that.
For remote perspective, you need to store this stuff. What database or maybe place where you can store, which is a better solution for that?
So he's asking where you would store a refresh token. Now, a refresh token might be an opaque token, right? It doesn't have to be a JWT, right? So it's just a random string of characters. It doesn't really mean anything. So I don't think you need to encrypt it and store it in a key vault or anything like that. I think storing in a database is just fine. But a lot of times, like, you're only dealing with 5 minutes. So do you really need to store it anywhere? Or can you just keep it in your session, right? So for the most part, like me dealing with Spring Security, it handles it for me, right? I don't have to store it anywhere. Get down into storing it and managing it. You could, but chances are there's an SDK you can use where you don't have to worry about it, and it'll do it for you.
Refresh install, for example, for 4 months. You need to store.
Oh, that's not going to last through the session then, yeah. So I would just store in the database, right?
Run some scheduled job, by example.
But again, I haven't implemented that, so you might not want to take my advice as the best way to do it. Like, do your own research and
I think it's better to do some Redis. You can put look Redis HTTL.
right. If you do like the sub and the refresh token, yeah, that would be good. And chances are the refresh token is a JWT, right? It does have that expired information in it, so you can do them that way. Did you want a piece of swag? DevOps or Angular mini book? DevOps? All right. I'll just hand it to this guy and he can hand it back. We had another question?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, since your time at the most secure company in the world, have you ever been hacked? Like, has it ever happened?
Have I ever been hacked?
Exploited the code.
So
Yeah, you or the company, whichever.
this is live on YouTube, huh? So my favorite story is I was at Devox UK probably 2-3 years in, and I'm doing a JHipster demo, and it takes like forever to create a JHipster app, right? It's like 10 minutes, and I'm just talking through it, right, as npm install is happening or whatever. And after it, I turned to my JHipster like colleagues, right, the other committers on the project, and I was like, how long does it take you all to create a JHipster app? And they're like, oh, 9 seconds or maybe a minute. Like 10 minutes. And so there was security software on my computer, right, that's basically monitoring files. And I put in a request to have, that directory that I would create files in, exempt. And it took them probably 2 or 3 weeks to get back to me. By the time they got back to me, I had removed all the software installed for security on my laptop. And they didn't prevent me. And I had coworkers like giving me advice how to do it, right? And then I went out late one night with some friends and I left my laptop in the cab in the Uber. And so that was scary because I was like, this is how I get fired, right? Like they're going to be like, oh, no big deal. You know, you lost your laptop. We'll just remote wipe it. And I would be like, I don't think you can do that. Like I did have Apple Care on it, right? And I did have the ability to remote wipe it myself via Apple, but it wasn't via Okta, right? And the thing is, we did have an incident where someone got into one of our third-party providers and actually was able to capture screenshots. I think it's Lapsus was the name of it, and they did it to other companies as well. But they were able to actually, capture a screenshot of an administrative screen that they had access to, right? And so after that happened, they really started locking things down. This is about maybe 2.5 years ago, and the CEO admitted that he was using his personal laptop as well, which is pretty much what mine was, right? It was given to me by the company, but I had removed all the software and everything. So last summer, they really started cracking down, and you couldn't access any of the internal things if you didn't have the software installed. And so I just got an M1 and now it's fast, right? And now I don't have to worry about that. So everyone has been somewhat forced to, keep that software on. And now we can only use Chrome. We can't use anyone else to access, like you can use a local host, right? You can use Safari or Firefox, but if you're accessing Okta things, you have to use Chrome because they can manage it and they can what would you say, deny list, like sort of extensions that might be malicious or something like that. But yeah, there was an incident. Our stock price reflects it.
Wait, did you get your laptop back?
Oh yeah, yep. I was sweating it for a while there.
Was it trashed or?
No, it took 36 hours to get it back because the lady was working like night shift, right? She didn't wake up till the next night, and then she was like, I'll bring it back to you tomorrow. And I'm just like, so I think I gave her like 100 when she gave it back to me. I was like, thank you so much. It was misplaced. And they never knew they had a laptop. They just had a backpack. But the funny thing was, I got a brand new pair of Bose headphones that night in my backpack. So someone must have been riding that Uber after me and like stuck their headphones in or something. Like I talked to the people I was with, no one had Bose headphones, but I ended up with a brand new like $300 set of Bose. And right. Right. Yeah. But then I left them on a plane like 2 months ago. So karma.
You should put air tags on everything.
Well, my wife, funny you should say that. My wife did buy me 2 of them and gave them to me for this trip. She was like, put one in your luggage, put one in your wallet. So I haven't done the wallet thing yet, but I do have it. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming. And there's this swag up here. I'll set out.
Don't go anywhere yet. Hold on, we got giveaways. More goggles.
You want one of those?
Let's take that triangular one.
Angular, there you go.
Because it's got info Q on there. That's
Yeah, there you go. It's a bunch of Spring Boot stuff too. And then I'll put these out here.
Wait.
Yep.
You can put the.
My paperclip worked that whole time too. Can you
did it?
believe that?
Oh, cool. Yeah, for this, I'm just gonna hold it.
Try to get it out. What did you need?
Oh, the slides.
slides?
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
If you want to stay around for the giveaways,
Yep.
we're still doing those, right, Mike?
Yep, absolutely.
We'll do a giveaway.
All right. So, oh, there we go. All right. So I just want to talk about some upcoming events. I'm sure there's a number of them that I've missed. But this week is EclipseCon going on in Germany. What's that? Oh, I'm not screen sharing. Oh.
There.
All right, perfect. And then, yep. All right. JCon World is going on next month, and because the Garden State Java User Group is a partner with JCon, there are free tickets to all of you. And it's all virtual, so you don't have to travel anywhere. So anyway, so I'll be sending out an email with more information on that. I may have done that. I may have done so already. There's a Jakarta One conference on December 5th of this year. That's been also a virtual conference since it started before the pandemic, before virtual conferences were a thing. So So anyway, so stay tuned for that. I'm on the program committee for that. We're sort of selecting the 10 talks. For that should be fun. And it's also December 5th is a target date for the first milestone release of Jakarta EE11. So that's something else that's with that date. So for the remainder of the year, next month, we have Brian Demers from, he's with Demers. Okay.
He's my old coworker.
Yes, I know.
He would call me Raible and I'd call him Demers. So it's
Demers,
yeah.
Demers. I better remember that for next month. So he's with Gradle, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And so he'll be here to talk about their developer productivity engineering. And then on the 12th, we have Ronald DeHeiser, and he is going to talk about Job Runner. So it's a job in RUNR. This is a utility that he's developed for the last few years. So he's going to come here, and he may do a similar thing like Matt's been doing. He was with Philly last night, going to be in New York tomorrow night. And so yeah, speakers we need to schedule for 2024 is Dimitri Troiko from Bellsoft and Jim Bethencourt. And Jim will demonstrate his refactor first utility. And we're going to try to get other folks like Mark Heckler, Trisha G, and Neil Ford. And maybe we'll try to get Venkat again.
I would.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so the Friends of the Garden State Java User Group, I just mentioned Matt was at Philly last night. He talked about comparing native Java REST API frameworks. Philly Jug next month is yours truly. We'll talk about Jakarta EE11, going beyond the era of Java EE. And this will be a debut presentation for me. I'm still putting the final touches on it. So I look forward to visiting with them next month. Tomorrow night, Matt is, as I mentioned, in New York, going to talk about choosing the right Java REST framework. And then Kansas City also tomorrow night, as you see there. And Chicago, they're going to have George, I think George's, or how do you pronounce that? Saab? Just George. George. Okay, with the S at the end. I kind of figured change the pronunciation, but he is with Oracle, and he's a big name in the company, and so they'll in Chicago next week, and then the Boston Java Users Group will meet on Thursday, November 9th. They just had their meeting this month, last week. So, all right. So enough of that. So if you're interested in a license to IntelliJ IDEA, please scan that QR code. But for the other giveaways we have a micro profile hoodie. There are various sizes in there still. Yes. Yeah, and then there, how many books you have, Barry?
I don't know, take a look. I think there are 4 or 5.
Where are they?
Was I not supposed to give them away?
No, were those no, that's fine. They're gone.
Oh, okay,
Right.
they're all gone.
Yeah,
Okay,
sorry.
then never mind.
There's one Angular mini book left, but since no one took it, I would not auction it off. Or people are gonna be like, I didn't want it.
All right, so let's do the hoodie. Let's do the thing that Gene Boyarsky did one time. So let's start. Everybody, we're gonna do a count, and then you remember your number, and then Barry's going to.
And if you don't want it, just say skip.
Okay,
So we
that's.
start at the beginning, count
Yep.
1 to wherever.
I will start with the young man over here. Okay, let's go.
Skip again.
4. 6. I think you're 6. And then you're 7.
Like a counting practice.
Yeah, skip, okay. Okay. Yeah, 8. Okay. 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 All right. So remember your number.
Next time, I think we should.
1 through 14 is what we have. Yes.
Random.
And it's a nice hoodie. I think actually somebody's, are you wearing your? Yes, see that? There we go. We have one being modeled right here. So I got these back in, I want to say April timeframe, and it was still a little bit cold, but during the summer, I mean, who's going to want a hoodie? So anyway, I brought them back last month, so.
Are you coding it?
So
He's writing it right now.
1 to 14, are we ready?
let's do it.
All right, generate, 11.
11, who's 11?
He's already got
Oh, he's already got one, okay.
Didn't you skip?
I'm ready to skip actually.
Okay, all right, okay.
Oh, you did?
Here we go.
It'll be 11 again.
13.
Who's 13? 13, there we go. All right, so when, afterwards, just come over here and, you know, you can get your, yeah. Oh, yes. So anyway, yeah, so if you fill out this form, if you want your email to be on my distribution list, please, you know, add it there. And then, so I'll run my utility probably tomorrow morning. And I'll send an email to the person who won the license to IntelliJ. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention was there is a Java with VS Code that came out.
There's a Java plugin. for
That's it.
VS
Yes.
Code.
Yeah. Something like that. I thought I brought my phone up here to read it, but anyway, we mentioned VS Code earlier, so, but has it?
No, Oracle released one. So the one that's.
Yeah.
For a while, so.
That's right. So,
That's why I knew about the.
Right, it's Oracle, that's all I know. Like,
So-
so they think it's better than everyone else's.
yeah, so somebody reached out to me today on that. So, yeah, so, but yeah, and that's it.
Slice of pizza.
Yes. Finish them up. Thanks again for coming. We hope to see you on November 14th. You know, we'll have the Eventbrite.
Where's the beer slot?
Oh, wait, that's right. There we go.
We don't wanna pump it's done until we see the beer.
That's right. So anyway, so when you go home, pour yourself a good craft beer and enjoy the rest of the night. And thanks for coming out. Thanks for your support. And we hope to see you next month. Thanks.